Sometimes, the most powerful moments happen when we think no one is watching. Sometimes the deepest healing comes from the most unexpected places. Elijah Moore built a tech empire worth billions, but he couldn't build a bridge to his own 6-year-old blind son. After his wife's death, work became his refuge, while strangers raised Caleb. Then one evening he came home early to find Maria, their quiet housekeeper, teaching his son to play piano. But when those tiny fingers began playing a melody, his late wife's secret lullaby that she never taught anyone, everything changed. How could this woman know a song that died with his wife? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The framed photograph on Elijah Moore's mahogany desk had been turned face down for 732 days. He knew the exact count because each morning, as he settled into his leather chair to review quarterly reports, his eyes would drift to that silver frame lying flat against the wood grain. Inside was a picture from their wedding day, Sarah in flowing ivory silk, her dark hair crowned with baby's breath, her fingers interlaced with his as they stood before the old gospel piano at her grandmother's church. She'd insisted on that piano for their ceremony, saying music was the language souls spoke when words weren't enough. That was 11 years ago, when Elijah believed love could conquer any challenge life presented. Now, at 55, he inhabited a different world, one measured in stock portfolios, board meetings, and the comfortable distance money could buy from emotional complexity. His corner office on the 42nd floor of downtown Atlanta overlooked a city he'd helped reshape through his cybersecurity firm, More Dynamics. The view was magnificent. Glass towers reaching toward heaven, highways threading through urban canyons like silver ribbons, the distant Blue Ridge Mountains standing eternal against the horizon. But Elijah rarely looked up from his screens anymore. "Sir, your 4 o'clock cancelled," his assistant Jennifer announced through the intercom. At 62, Jennifer had weathered 3 decades in corporate America with the steady grace of someone who understood that successful men often needed mothering more than managing. "Would you like me to push the Hartwell meeting to this afternoon?" "No." Elijah's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his smallest preferences obeyed. "I'll review the Jakarta projections instead," but his fingers had already stilled on the keyboard. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his office, and somewhere in those shadows lived memories he'd spent 2 years trying to bury. Sarah laughing as she attempted to teach him piano scales. Sarah singing lullabies to their newborn son, her voice soft as prayer. Sarah in the hospital bed, her hand growing cold in his as machines marked the end of everything he'd thought permanent. The cybersecurity business had been their shared dream once. Sarah, with her master's in computer science and her intuitive understanding of human behavior, had been his perfect partner in both business and life. She'd insisted they start the company, not just to build wealth, but to create something meaningful, protecting people's digital lives in an increasingly connected world. "We're not just securing data," she'd often said during late-night strategy sessions. "We're preserving trust." After her death, Elijah had thrown himself into expansion with the single-minded intensity of a man trying to outrun grief. More Dynamics had tripled in size, absorbing smaller firms across 3 continents. Government contracts followed, then partnerships with Fortune 500 companies. The business became his sanctuary, the only place where cause and effect still made sense, where problems had solutions and success could be measured in concrete numbers. At home, in the sprawling mansion Sarah had filled with music and laughter, Elijah moved through rooms like a ghost visiting his former life. The house sat on 5 acres in Buckhead, all stone and timber and tall windows that Sarah had chosen because they'd let the music float free. Now it felt more like a museum of abandoned dreams. The formal living room with its baby grand piano remained exactly as Sarah had left it. Sheet music still spread across the bench, her coffee mug still marked with faint lipstick on the ceramic rim. Elijah had locked that room the day after her funeral and hadn't entered it since. Caleb had been 4 when his mother died. Now 6, he navigated their grand house with the careful precision of a child who'd learned to map his world through sound and touch. Born with Leber congenital amaurosis, a rare genetic condition that had stolen his sight, Caleb possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify people by their footsteps, their breathing patterns, the particular way they moved through space. He could tell when Maria was approaching by the soft shuffle of her worn house shoes, could recognize Dr. Martinez by the gentle jingle of the keys on his lanyard, but Elijah's footsteps, sharp, purposeful, usually brief, had become a source of anxious anticipation rather than comfort. When his father came home, Caleb would sit straighter in whatever chair he occupied, hands folded properly in his lap, waiting for the brief exchange that constituted their daily interaction. "How was your day, son?" "Good, Daddy. Maria and I worked on my reading. That's good. I have some calls to make." And then the sharp footsteps would retreat, leaving Caleb to wonder why his father's voice always sounded like it was coming from very far away, even when he was standing close. Maria Gonzalez had answered Elijah's employment advertisement 6 months after Sarah's death, when it became clear that a succession of younger nannies weren't working out. At 53, Maria possessed the steady competence of someone who'd raised 4 children of her own before they scattered across the country pursuing their own dreams. Her reference letters described her as reliable, discreet, and experienced with special needs children. What they hadn't mentioned was her intuitive understanding that sometimes children needed something more than just care. They needed someone who could see past their limitations to their possibilities. Maria's own story was one of quiet resilience. She'd immigrated from Guatemala 30 years ago with a husband who'd promised her American dreams but delivered only disappointment and alcohol-scented rage. After their divorce, she'd supported herself and her children through a combination of house cleaning, childcare, and the occasional catering job for wealthy families who appreciated her authentic cooking. She'd learned to read the emotional climate of houses the way meteorologists read weather patterns, understanding which rooms held joy, which corners harbored sorrow, and which spaces had been abandoned to grief. The Moore mansion, she'd recognized immediately, was a house in mourning, not just for the obvious reason. The locked music room, the covered mirrors, the way Mr. Moore's shoulders curved inward like a man protecting a wound, but for the deeper loss that occurred when families stopped believing in their own capacity for joy. Caleb, she'd understood from their first meeting, was a child suspended between worlds. Brilliant in the way that children with limitations often become, he'd developed an extraordinary memory and an almost mystical sensitivity to the emotional currents around him. He could recite entire books after hearing them once, could identify birds by their songs, could tell when adults were lying by some subtle change in their breathing patterns. But he was also profoundly lonely, trapped in a house full of careful silence, where laughter had been retired, along with his mother's photographs. Dr. Elena Martinez, Caleb's child psychologist, had been gentle but direct in her assessment during their monthly consultations. Children process grief differently than adults, she'd explained to Elijah during one of their sessions. They need permission to feel their loss, but they also need assurance that life can be joyful again. Right now, Caleb is modeling his emotional responses on yours. If you remain closed off from joy, he'll learn that's the appropriate way to honor his mother's memory. Elijah had nodded politely, written the check for Dr. Martinez's services, and promptly ignored her advice. Allowing joy felt like betrayal. Sarah deserved better than to be forgotten in favor of moving on, but children have their own wisdom, and Caleb had been slowly, quietly conducting his own experiments in healing. He'd discovered that Maria hummed while she worked, not loudly but with a musical unconsciousness that filled the house's corners with gentle sound. He'd learned that if he sat very still while she folded laundry, she might begin singing in Spanish, her voice rich with memories of grandmother's lullabies and church hymns that had survived immigration and heartbreak. Sometimes, when his father was locked away in his home office conducting video conferences with teams scattered across time zones, Caleb would ask Maria to describe colors. Not the simple definitions, red like fire, blue like sky, but the emotional resonance of color. Yellow, Maria would say, is the feeling when you remember something happy. Green is the sound of rain on leaves. Purple is the color of missing someone in a beautiful way. These conversations, conducted in the kitchen while Maria prepared meals or in the sunroom while she tended to Sarah's neglected plants, became the foundation of an understanding that transcended language. Maria recognized in Caleb not just a child who couldn't see, but a soul who perceived the world with unusual depth. And Caleb, starved for the kind of attention that sought to understand rather than simply manage his needs, began to trust that Maria might be someone worth sharing his inner world with. The house itself seemed to exhale a little more freely with Maria's presence. She opened windows that had been sealed shut, allowed natural light to chase shadows from corners where grief had pooled like stagnant water. She cooked with aromatic spices that reminded the rooms they'd once been filled with celebration. She spoke to Caleb not in the careful, therapeutic language adults typically used with disabled children, but with the natural rhythm of someone who understood that respect was more healing than pity. Still, there were boundaries Maria didn't cross. The locked music room remained locked. Family photographs stayed covered or stored. She never asked about Mrs. Moore directly, understanding that some wounds needed to heal at their own pace. Instead, she began the slower work of teaching a household to remember what normal life felt like when it wasn't organized entirely around loss. James Patterson, Elijah's business partner and oldest friend, had been watching this careful dance of avoidance for 2 years with growing concern. A man who'd known Elijah since their graduate school days at Georgia Tech, James understood better than anyone how completely his friend had retreated from any version of happiness. Their weekly business dinners had become exercises in polite pretense, James asking about Caleb, Elijah deflecting with updates about educational therapists and mobility training. Neither man acknowledging the obvious truth that a child needed more than professional services and a distant father. You know, Sarah wouldn't have wanted this. James had ventured during one particularly strained evening, his words careful as someone approaching a wild animal. Sarah's not here to want anything, Elijah had replied, his voice carrying the finality of someone who'd ended that conversation many times before. But even as he spoke those words, Elijah knew they weren't entirely true. Sometimes in the suspended moments between sleep and waking, he could still hear Sarah's voice offering gentle counsel about patience, about the long view of love, about trusting that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. Those moments terrified him more than any business crisis or financial setback, because they reminded him that beneath his carefully constructed emotional armor lived a man who missed his wife with an intensity that threatened to consume everything else. So he worked later, traveled more frequently, accepted every speaking engagement and board appointment that could keep him occupied until exhaustion made sleep possible. The strategy had worked for 2 years, creating a life that was functional, if not fulfilling, productive, if not joyful, until this particular Tuesday evening, when a delayed flight and a cancelled dinner meeting sent him home 3 hours earlier than usual, briefcase in hand and mind focused on the merger documents that required his review. He'd pushed through the front door, expecting the familiar silence of a house running on professional efficiency, expecting to find Caleb in his bedroom with Maria, reading him some improving book about science or history. Instead, he'd heard music, tentative, halting but unmistakably musical notes floating down the main staircase like an invitation to remember everything he'd tried to forget. The melody drifted down from the second floor like a question mark made of sound, hesitant notes that seemed to be searching for their proper place in a sequence Elijah almost recognized. He stood motionless in the marble foyer, briefcase still in hand, his mind struggling to process what his ears were telling him. Piano music in his house, in a house where the grand piano had been locked away for 2 years, where music had been as carefully excluded as joy itself. His first instinct was anger, sharp, familiar, and easier than the alternative emotions threatening to surface. Someone had violated the boundaries he'd established. Someone had accessed the locked music room without permission. But as he moved toward the staircase, following the source of the sound, he realized the notes were coming from somewhere else entirely. The music grew clearer as he climbed the steps, his Italian leather shoes whispering against the runner Sarah had chosen because it reminded her of her grandmother's house. The melody was being played on something electronic, a keyboard, he realized, not the acoustic piano gathering dust behind locked doors. But that distinction seemed suddenly irrelevant as recognition bloomed in his chest like a physical ache. He knew this song. At the top of the stairs, he turned toward Caleb's bedroom, where a door stood partially open, spilling warm lamplight into the hallway. Through the gap, he could see Maria sitting beside his son on the small bench they used for reading sessions. But instead of books, there was a compact digital keyboard balanced on the desk, something that definitely hadn't been there that morning. When he'd looked in on Caleb before leaving for work, "Feel how your pinky wants to curve just a little," Maria was saying, her voice carrying the patient guidance of someone who understood that learning happened in layers, not all at once. "Don't worry about pressing too hard. The music lives in the gentleness." Caleb's face bore an expression Elijah hadn't seen in 2 years, complete absorption, the kind of focused joy that children display when they discover something that speaks to their deepest nature. His small fingers moved across the keys with surprising confidence, picking out a melody that was achingly familiar yet somehow transformed by the tentative touch of a child who'd never seen sheet music, but who seemed to understand intuitively how notes connected to emotions. "Where did this come from?" Caleb asked, his voice bright with curiosity. "This song makes me feel like Mama is in the room." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. Maria's hands stilled over the keyboard, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the house's heating system cycling on against the October chill. "Your mama used to sing this," Maria said carefully. "She had a beautiful voice. I think maybe music runs in families, like the color of eyes or the shape of hands. But how do you know what Mama sounded like?" Caleb's question carried the innocent directness of a child who hadn't yet learned that some topics were off limits. "Daddy doesn't like to talk about her singing." Maria was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap, as she seemed to consider how much truth a 6-year-old could handle. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful weight of someone choosing words like stepping stones across dangerous water. Sometimes people who love music recognize each other, even across time. "Your mama loved this song very much. She used to hum it when she was thinking about beautiful things." The melody Caleb resumed playing was one Elijah hadn't heard in over 2 years, a simple lullaby Sarah had hummed during late-night feedings, during quiet moments when she'd thought no one else was listening, during the private conversations she'd have with Caleb when he was a baby, and she believed he couldn't understand her words, but might absorb the love in her voice. It wasn't a song from any book or recording. Sarah had claimed she couldn't remember where she'd learned it, only that it had lived somewhere in her memory since childhood, surfacing when she needed comfort or wanted to offer it to someone else. She'd hummed it while cooking dinner, while folding laundry, while working late on business plans at the kitchen table. It had been the soundtrack to their most ordinary moments, so woven into the fabric of their daily life that Elijah had barely noticed it until its absence left their house, ringing with silence. Now his 6-year-old son was playing it with the natural ease of someone who'd been born knowing its contours, and their housekeeper was guiding his hands as if she'd heard Sarah's voice every day for the past 2 years. "Where did you find this keyboard?" Elijah's voice cut through the music, causing both Maria and Caleb to startle. He hadn't meant to sound harsh, but control was slipping away from him with each note his son played. Maria rose from the bench, her posture respectful but not apologetic. "In the storage room, Mr. Moore, wrapped in a blanket with some other musical things. I thought maybe Caleb might enjoy learning." "Daddy!" Caleb's face brightened with the eager hope of a child who'd discovered something wonderful and wanted desperately to share it. "Listen to what I learned today. Maria says my fingers are good for music, just like Mama's were." But Elijah's attention was fixed on Maria, whose calm presence suddenly seemed charged with mystery. "You found it in storage?" "Yes, sir. In the room beside the laundry. There was a note attached, 'For Caleb when he's ready.'" The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. He could see Sarah's handwriting in his mind, could imagine her in the weeks before Caleb's birth, nesting with the instinctive preparation of expectant mothers. She'd bought the keyboard as a backup plan, he remembered now, something portable for the nursery, for late-night moments when the baby gran might be too loud or too formal. She'd wrapped it carefully, written that note in her careful script, and stored it away with the certainty that someday their child would be ready to discover the music that lived in his mother's heart. "But how did you know that song?" The question emerged before Elijah could stop it, carrying 2 years of carefully suppressed emotion. "That specific melody. Sarah never taught it to anyone. She said it was just something she remembered from being very small." Maria met his gaze steadily, and something in her expression suggested depths he'd never bothered to explore. "Mr. Moore, sometimes songs travel in ways we don't expect. Maybe they pass between people who understand what it means to love someone very much." Before Elijah could respond, Caleb's voice cut through the tension with the clarity of a child who sensed adult complexity but couldn't decode its meaning. "Daddy, will you listen to me play? Maria says I'm learning fast because I can hear all the spaces between the notes. She says that's something special." Elijah looked down at his son, really looked at him, and saw Sarah's expression reflected in Caleb's face. The same focused intensity when approaching something beautiful, the same slight smile when discovery was happening, the same unconscious way of tilting his head when concentrating deeply. For a moment the resemblance was so strong that Elijah felt as though Sarah was in the room, watching through their child's sightless eyes, waiting to see what choice he would make. "I need to get back to work," he said finally, the words emerging from some automatic part of his mind that defaulted to avoidance when confronted with anything that might require him to feel more than he could handle. Caleb's face fell with the particular devastation of childhood disappointment. "But Daddy, I wanted to play for you. Maria says music is how people's hearts talk to each other when regular words aren't enough." The phrase was so perfectly Sarah, something she might have said when Caleb was too small to understand, that Elijah had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. He looked again at Maria, this quiet woman who'd somehow accessed not just his late wife's belongings, but her very language, her way of explaining the world to their son. "How long have you been teaching him?" he managed. "Just today. But he learns like someone who's been waiting his whole life for this." Maria's voice carried no challenge or judgment, only the simple truth of someone who'd recognized something important and acted on it. Elijah wanted to leave, to retreat to his office, where the complications of merger documents would provide blessed distraction from the emotional chaos threatening to overwhelm him. But Caleb's fingers had found the keyboard again, picking out those hauntingly familiar notes with increasing confidence. And the sound was pulling at something in Elijah's chest that he'd spent 2 years trying to keep buried. "Play it once more," he heard himself say, the words emerging before his rational mind could stop them, and as his son's small hands moved across the keys, filling the room with a lullaby that had died with Sarah but somehow lived on in the memory of a woman whose presence in their house was beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like providence. Elijah realized that the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart were developing cracks that might be impossible to repair. Sleep eluded Elijah that night, like a solution to a problem he couldn't quite articulate. He lay in the king-sized bed that had felt too large and too empty for 2 years, staring at the ceiling while Caleb's halting piano melody played on repeat in his mind. Every time he began to drift toward unconsciousness, he would hear those tentative notes again, and his eyes would snap open as if his nervous system refused to let him rest, until he'd solved the mystery of how Maria had known Sarah's private lullaby. By 3 a.m., he'd given up on sleep entirely and made his way to his home office, a sanctuary lined with awards, business school diplomas, and photographs of himself with politicians and tech industry leaders, carefully curated evidence of a life built on quantifiable achievement. But tonight, even the familiar comfort of his accomplishments felt hollow against the memory of his son's face. Bright with the kind of joy Elijah hadn't seen since before Sarah's accident, he pulled Maria's employment file from his desk drawer, documents he'd barely glanced at when James had recommended her through his own housekeeper's network. The basics were standard. Maria Elena Gonzalez, born in Guatemala City in 1971, immigrated to the United States in 1994, divorced, mother of 4. Previous employers had provided glowing references describing her reliability, discretion, and particular skill with special needs children. But nowhere in the careful documentation of her employment history was there any mention of musical training or connection to anyone named Sarah Moore. Elijah found himself studying the single photograph clipped to her application, a small headshot that showed a woman with prematurely grey hair pulled back severely, kind eyes, and the composed expression of someone who'd learned to present herself professionally, despite whatever personal storms she'd weathered. Looking at that image now, he realized how little attention he'd paid to Maria as an actual person, rather than simply as a solution to his domestic needs. The sound of small footsteps in the hallway interrupted his brooding. Caleb moved through the house at night with the confident navigation of someone who'd memorized every floorboard, every turn, every obstacle in his limited world. But tonight his movement seemed different, less purposeful, more restless. "Dad," Caleb's voice came from the office doorway, uncertain and small. "What are you doing up, son?" "I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about the music." Caleb moved into the room with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to assume anything about unfamiliar space, his hands trailing along the wall until he found the leather chair positioned beside Elijah's desk. "Dad, why don't we have music in our house anymore?" The question was so direct, so free of the careful adult diplomacy that usually surrounded discussions of Sarah, that Elijah found himself momentarily speechless. In the 2 years since the accident, no one, not Dr. Martinez, not James, not the parade of well-meaning therapists and counselors, had asked him that particular question with such stark simplicity. "Music was your mother's thing," he said finally, aware of how inadequate the explanation sounded even as he spoke it. "But I'm her son too." Caleb's voice carried the logical persistence of a child who hadn't yet learned that some adult decisions didn't make rational sense. "Maria says music lives in families. She says, maybe I got Mama's music fingers." Elijah studied his son's face in the lamplight, Sarah's delicate bone structure, her expressive eyebrows, but with his own stubborn jawline, and the particular way of tilting his head when concentrating that Elijah recognized from his own childhood photographs. How much of Sarah lived on in this boy? And how much had Elijah missed by treating Caleb's needs as problems to be managed rather than gifts to be discovered? "Tell me about today," he found himself saying, "with the keyboard. What did it feel like?" Caleb's entire posture changed, shoulders straightening with the eager energy of someone who'd been waiting desperately to share something important. "It was like the keys were talking to me, Dad. Maria showed me how to make them say different things, happy things and sad things and thinking things. And when I played that song, it felt like Mama was listening. The last sentence was delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that Elijah felt something break loose in his chest, not painfully, but like the first crack in ice that signals the coming thaw. "Maria seems to know a lot about music," he said carefully. "She told me she used to sing in church when she was little back in Guatemala. She said her grandmother taught her that music is how people remember love, even when the person who loved them isn't there anymore." Caleb paused, his unseeing eyes fixed on some internal vision that seemed to bring him comfort. "Do you think Mama can hear music in heaven?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge Elijah wasn't sure he was ready to cross. For 2 years, he'd avoided any conversation that might require him to articulate what he believed about life after death, about whether love survived physical absence, about whether the connection he'd felt with Sarah in 22 years of marriage had simply ended when her heart stopped beating. "I think," he said slowly, choosing words with the care of someone walking on thin ice, "that if love is real enough, it finds ways to continue even when we can't understand how." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was more theological reflection than he'd offered anyone since the funeral, and Caleb seemed to accept it as sufficient. "Maria says she wants to teach me more songs. She says there are lullabies from all over the world, and that every grandmother who ever rocked a baby has added something to the music that keeps children safe at night." Caleb's voice grew sleepy as he spoke, the combination of late hour and emotional honesty finally catching up with him. "Would you like to learn more songs?" Elijah asked, surprising himself with the question. "Yes, but I want you to hear them too. I want to play music for you the way Mama used to." The simple desire, expressed with such innocent directness, pierced through all of Elijah's careful defenses. He realized that in his determination to protect both himself and Caleb from further loss, he'd also protected them from the possibility of connection, of discovering what forms love might take when it was allowed to grow beyond grief. "Maybe we can arrange that," he said, the words committing him to something he wasn't sure he was ready for, but couldn't bring himself to refuse. After helping Caleb back to bed, Elijah returned to his office, but found his attention wandering from Maria's employment file to other documents, ones he'd avoided looking at for 2 years. Sarah's laptop, still charged and waiting on the bookshelf where she'd left it the morning of her accident. Her phone, its voicemail still containing messages he couldn't bear to delete. Her music collection, both digital and physical, organized with the meticulous care of someone who believed that art deserved reverence. Moving almost without conscious decision, he opened Sarah's laptop and waited for the familiar chime of startup. Her desktop wallpaper was a photograph from Caleb's first birthday, the 3 of them in their sunroom, Sarah at the keyboard, while a barely walking Caleb stood beside her, his tiny hands reaching for keys that seemed impossibly large in comparison to his fingers. They were all laughing at something outside the frame, caught in one of those perfect moments that feel ordinary when you're living them and precious beyond measure when they're all you have. Left, Sarah's music folder contained hundreds of files, classical pieces she'd studied in college, jazz standards she'd learned for fun, original compositions she'd worked on during quiet afternoons when Caleb napped and the house felt full of possibility. But buried among the familiar titles was a folder he'd never noticed before, labeled simply "For Caleb." Inside were audio files dated throughout her pregnancy and the first few months after Caleb's birth, recordings of Sarah humming, singing, experimenting with melodies that might soothe or delight their son. The lullaby Maria had somehow known was there, recorded on an October evening when Caleb was 3 months old and fighting a cold that had kept the whole family awake for days. "My grandmother used to sing this to my mother," Sarah's voice said in the recording, speaking to Caleb in that gentle, conversational tone parents use with babies who seem to understand everything and nothing, and her grandmother sang it to her. It doesn't have words in any language anyone remembers, but I think it says something like, "You are loved, you are safe, you are exactly who you were meant to be." As Elijah listened to his wife's voice from beyond the grave, explaining family musical traditions he'd never heard her mention while she was alive, he began to understand that there were parts of Sarah's history, pieces of her identity and inheritance, that she'd preserved for their son in ways he'd never imagined. And somehow, impossibly, Maria had become the keeper of that legacy, the bridge between a mother's hopes and a child's readiness to receive them. The revelation left him sitting in his office as dawn light began to creep through the windows, wondering how many other gifts Sarah had left for Caleb, and how many he'd inadvertently kept hidden by his determination to seal away anything that might remind them, both of what they'd lost. The next morning brought the kind of crisp October clarity that made Atlanta's skyline look sharp enough to cut glass. Elijah sat in his office with James Patterson across from his desk, ostensibly discussing the Jakarta merger, but finding his attention consistently drifting to questions that had nothing to do with quarterly projections or market penetration. Strategies. "You're not hearing a word I'm saying," James observed with the directness of someone who'd known Elijah long enough to recognize when his friend's mind was elsewhere. At 57, James had weathered the tech industry's evolution from garage startups to global corporations, and he'd developed the intuitive people-reading skills of someone who'd learned that successful business was ultimately about understanding human nature. "What's got you distracted?" Elijah found himself describing the previous evening's discovery, the keyboard, the lullaby, Maria's mysterious knowledge of Sarah's private songs, with the bewilderment of someone trying to solve a puzzle that seemed to be missing crucial pieces. "You think she's lying about something?" James's question was careful, non-judgmental, but it carried the protective instinct of someone who'd watched his best friend barely survive devastating loss and didn't want to see him hurt again. "I don't know what I think." But James, she knew a song that Sarah never taught anyone. A melody Sarah claimed she couldn't even remember learning herself. Elijah pulled up Maria's employment file on his computer screen, as if the familiar documents might suddenly reveal hidden information. "There's no connection between them in any of this paperwork. No mutual acquaintances, no overlapping history." James leaned back in his chair, studying Elijah with the expression of someone who suspected the real issue was more complex than missing documentation. "When's the last time you actually talked to Maria?" Not about schedules or Caleb's appointments, but talk to her as a person. The question hit harder than Elijah had expected. He realized that in 6 months of employing Maria, their conversations had been purely functional. Updates on Caleb's progress, requests for grocery shopping, brief exchanges about household logistics. He'd treated her as a service provider rather than as a human being with her own history, her own losses and hopes and dreams. "You hired her because she was qualified and came with excellent references," James continued. "But you never bothered to learn anything about who she actually is. Maybe the mystery isn't about what she's hiding. Maybe it's about what you've never bothered to ask." Before Elijah could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez requesting a phone consultation about Caleb's recent sessions. The timing felt like providence, another perspective on the changes happening in his carefully controlled household. "Dr. Martinez," Elijah said when the call connected 20 minutes later. "You wanted to discuss Caleb's progress?" "Actually, Mr. Moore, I wanted to discuss some remarkable changes I've observed in our recent sessions. Caleb seems more animated, more emotionally accessible than I've seen him since we began working together." Dr. Martinez's voice carried the cautious optimism of a professional who'd learned not to overstate improvements, but couldn't ignore significant positive changes. "He's been talking about music, about learning to play piano. He's also been asking more questions about his mother, not in the anxious, searching way we've seen before, but with a curiosity that suggests he's beginning to process his grief differently. His housekeeper found an old keyboard and has been teaching him to play. Maria, yes. Caleb speaks of her with genuine affection, But more importantly, he's been using language that suggests someone is helping him understand complex emotions in age-appropriate ways. Yesterday, he told me that missing his mother feels like a song that doesn't have an ending, but that maybe learning new music helps him understand that love doesn't stop just because people aren't there anymore. Dr. Martinez paused, and Elijah could hear the careful consideration in her silence. Mr. Moore, those aren't concepts a 6-year-old develops independently. Someone is providing him with sophisticated emotional framework while still honoring his developmental stage. I'm curious about Maria's background with child psychology. I don't know much about her background, Elijah admitted, the confession feeling like evidence of negligence he'd never recognized before. Perhaps it might be worth a conversation, not as an employer checking credentials, but as a parent trying to understand who's helping to shape your son's emotional development. That afternoon, Elijah found himself arriving home earlier than usual with a specific intention rather than his typical pattern of avoidance. He discovered Maria and Caleb in the sunroom, where she was reading to him from a book about different musical traditions around the world while he practiced finger exercises on the small keyboard that had somehow transformed from mysterious artifact into daily fixture. Mr. Moore. Maria rose with the respectful efficiency he'd grown accustomed to, but today he noticed something different in her manner, not deference exactly, but the quiet dignity of someone who understood her own value, regardless of how others chose to see her. Please, don't stop on my account. I'd actually like to listen if you don't mind. Caleb's face brightened with the particular joy of a child whose interests had suddenly become worthy of adult attention. Dad, Maria was telling me about Guatemala where she grew up. They have music there that sounds like rain and mountains and birds all together. Tell me about that, Elijah said, settling into a chair with the deliberate intention of actually hearing the answer. Maria's hands stilled on the book pages, and for a moment she seemed to be assessing whether his interest was genuine or merely polite. Whatever she saw in his expression must have satisfied her, because when she spoke, her voice carried the storytelling rhythm of someone sharing something precious. In my village, music was how we remembered who we were when everything else changed, she began. My grandmother could sing the history of our family in traditional songs. Who married whom, which years brought good harvests, how we survived when times were difficult. She said that as long as someone remembered the melodies, our people would never really disappear, like how Mama's lullaby helps me remember her. Caleb added, with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes display when adults give them permission to speak truth. Yes, exactly like that. Maria's voice was gentle as she looked between Caleb and Elijah. Your mama understood that music carries things that words alone cannot hold. Love, memory, hope, these things live in melody even when we cannot find language for them. How did you know what she understood? Elijah's question emerged more directly than he'd intended, but Maria didn't flinch from the implicit challenge. Because I lost someone too, she said simply. My daughter Lucia. She would be 25 now. If the cancer hadn't taken her when she was 16, the revelation hung in the sunroom's afternoon light, like a bridge suddenly appearing across a chasm Elijah hadn't known existed. In Maria's steady gaze, he recognized something he'd been too self-absorbed to see before, the particular way that surviving loss changed how someone moved through the world. The careful tenderness with which people who'd experienced devastating grief treated other people's pain. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it in a way that went beyond social convention. Lucia loved to sing, Maria continued, not professionally, just for joy. She used to say that when someone dies, their voice doesn't disappear. It finds new ways to be heard through people who remember how to listen. When I heard Caleb playing your wife's lullaby, when I saw how naturally his fingers found the melody, I thought maybe Lucia was right. Maybe love finds ways to continue, even when we think it's been lost forever. Caleb had grown still during this exchange. His face turned toward the adults with the concentrated attention of a child who sensed that something important was being shared. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful consideration of someone much older than 6. "Maria, do you think maybe our people who died can hear each other? Like maybe Lucia and Mama are friends now?" "I think," Maria said, reaching over to adjust Caleb's hand position on the keyboard, "that people who understand love recognize each other no matter where they are. And maybe they find ways to help the people they left behind. Remember that love doesn't end just because life does." As Elijah watched this exchange, the quiet intimacy of shared grief transformed into hope. The way Maria spoke to his son not as a damaged child who needed protection from difficult truths, but as a whole person capable of understanding complex emotions, he began to realize that the mystery he'd been trying to solve wasn't about how Maria had known Sarah's lullaby. The mystery was how he'd spent 2 years living in the same house with his son without recognizing that healing was possible, that connection could survive loss, that love might take different forms but didn't have to disappear when the person who embodied it was gone. "Would you like to hear what else Caleb has learned?" Maria asked, her eyes meeting Elijah's with a question that seemed to encompass more than musical progress. And for the first time in 2 years, Elijah found himself saying yes to something that might require him to feel more than he was sure he could handle. But that also promised the possibility of joy he'd forgotten was even available to him. The manila envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier to Elijah's office with the kind of efficient discretion he'd grown to expect from the private investigation firm James had recommended. Inside were 3 photographs, 2 birth certificates, and a handwritten letter in Spanish, along with a typed translation that made Elijah's coffee grow cold as he read. The photographs showed a young Maria, perhaps 25, with dark hair and the bright smile of someone who hadn't yet learned that life could take more than it gave. In the first image, she stood beside a piano in what looked like a small church, her hand resting on the shoulder of a teenage girl whose resemblance to her was unmistakable. The second showed the same girl, older in a hospital bed but smiling, her thin hands positioned over a small electronic keyboard. The third was a funeral program with both their faces, dated 18 months before Maria had answered Elijah's employment advertisement, but it was the letter written in Maria's own hand to someone named Father Miguel that contained the information that made Elijah understand he'd been asking the wrong questions about coincidence and connection. "I cannot stay in Phoenix any longer," the translated text read. "Every corner of this city reminds me of Lucia's voice, of the songs we sang together in your choir. I need to find work somewhere else, somewhere that might let me heal while still helping children who need what I learned from loving her. Mrs. Rodriguez says she knows someone in Atlanta who needs care for a special child. A boy who lost his mother young, the way Lucia lost her father. Maybe God is calling me to this work, to help another family remember that love can survive even the worst losses. Please pray that I can be worthy of whatever trust this new family might place in me." The letter was dated 7 months ago, just weeks before Maria had responded to his employment advertisement. But the detail that sent ice through Elijah's veins was the notation at the bottom, in different handwriting. "The child is named Caleb Moore. His mother was Sarah Elena Castellanos before her marriage. Lucia mentioned her several times during her treatment at Children's Hospital Phoenix. They were roommates for 3 weeks in 2019 when Sarah was there for complications during her pregnancy." Elijah stared at the document until the words blurred, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he was reading. Sarah had never mentioned a hospitalization during her pregnancy. He'd been traveling constantly those final months before Caleb's birth, managing the company's expansion into European markets, trusting that pregnancy was routine enough to be handled without his detailed attention. But apparently, during those weeks when he'd been focused on international contracts and product launches, his wife had been fighting complications serious enough to require hospitalization, forming connections with other patients. befriending a dying teenager from Guatemala, whose mother would later appear in his son's life as if summoned by Providence. The private investigator's note, clipped to the translation, filled in additional details that made the story even more complex. Sarah had been admitted to Children's Hospital Phoenix during a business trip when she'd experienced severe complications that required bed rest and monitoring. During her 3-week stay, she'd been assigned a room with Lucia Gonzalez, who was undergoing experimental treatment for leukemia. The hospital's music therapy program had brought them together daily, both women finding comfort in shared songs while facing uncertain futures. According to hospital records, the investigator's note continued, Mrs. Moore specifically requested that her roommate assignment not be changed, despite having the insurance coverage for a private room. Staff noted that both patients seemed to benefit from the companionship, particularly during music therapy sessions where they would harmonize traditional lullabies and folk songs. The final piece of documentation was a photocopy of a page from what appeared to be a hospital visitor's journal. With Sarah's handwriting clearly visible, Lucia taught me the most beautiful lullaby today, something her grandmother sang to her mother, and her great-grandmother sang to her grandmother. She says it doesn't have words because love doesn't need language, only melody. I'm going to learn it perfectly so I can sing it to my baby when he arrives. Lucia laughs when I tell her I'm sure it's a boy, but I know in my heart. And I know this song will help him feel safe when the world seems too big or too dark. Elijah sat back in his desk chair, the documents scattered across his blotter like pieces of a puzzle that had finally assembled itself into a picture he couldn't ignore. Maria hadn't mysteriously known Sarah's lullaby. She had taught it to Sarah. Her presence in their lives wasn't coincidence, but the fulfillment of a connection, forged between two mothers facing the possibility of loss, one who would survive to raise her child, and one who would lose her daughter but carry forward the songs they'd shared. The intercom's buzz interrupted his reverie. Mr. Moore, Dr. Martinez is here for your appointment. He'd forgotten about the meeting he'd requested, the one where he'd planned to ask Dr. Martinez about Maria's qualifications and background. Now, with the truth spread across his desk like evidence of his own blindness to the forces that had been reshaping his family, he felt overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions he couldn't begin to categorize. Dr. Martinez entered with the calm professionalism that had made her invaluable during the darkest period of his family's life. But today, her presence felt more like confession than consultation. I've been researching Maria's background, he began without preamble, then found himself describing not just what he'd discovered, but the growing realization that he'd spent 2 years constructing walls against the very connections that might have helped him and Caleb heal. So she knew your wife, Dr. Martinez said when he finished. Does that change how you feel about her influence on Caleb? I don't know how I feel about anything anymore. The admission emerged with the exhausted honesty of someone who'd run out of energy for maintaining emotional defenses. For 2 years, I've been so focused on protecting Caleb from additional loss that I never considered he might need connection more than protection. And now this woman appears who has access to parts of Sarah's history that I never even knew existed. Dr. Martinez leaned forward with the attentive posture of someone who recognized a breakthrough. Moment when it occurred, Mr. Moore, what scares you more? That Maria might not be trustworthy, or that she might be exactly what Caleb needs in ways you haven't been able to provide? The question cut straight to the fear Elijah had been avoiding since the night he'd first heard Caleb playing Sarah's lullaby. Not fear of Maria's motives or qualifications, but fear of his own inadequacy as a father, his own inability to access the parts of himself that might be capable of giving his son what he truly needed, rather than just what seemed professionally appropriate. I don't know how to be the kind of father who can compete with someone who carries pieces of his mother's heart. Who said anything about competing? Dr. Martinez's voice carried the gentle challenge of someone who understood that healing often required people to question their own assumptions. Caleb doesn't need you to replace what Maria provides. He needs you to be present for what only you can give him. Your own love, your own connection to his mother, your own capacity to see him as more than his limitations or losses. That evening, Elijah arrived home to find Maria and Caleb in the kitchen, working together to prepare dinner while music played softly from a small speaker, not the keyboard this time, but recorded songs that created a backdrop of gentle harmony for their domestic routine. Caleb was learning to identify spices by smell and texture, his face bright with concentration as he helped measure ingredients for what Maria was teaching him to call comfort soup. Dad. Caleb's greeting carried the eager warmth of a child who'd begun to expect his father's presence as pleasure rather than obligation. Maria's teaching me to cook. She says cooking is like music because it's about combining different things to make something beautiful. Elijah watched them work together, Maria's weathered hands guiding Caleb's small ones, her patient corrections offered with the kind of gentle encouragement that built confidence rather than dependence, and recognized that he was witnessing something that went beyond childcare or education. He was seeing love in action, the daily practice of someone who understood that healing happened through attention, through presence, through the accumulated small kindnesses that create safety for hearts that have been broken. Would you like to help? Maria asked, her invitation including him in their domestic ritual without making his participation feel like intrusion or charity. For a moment, Elijah felt the familiar impulse to retreat to his office, to maintain the emotional distance that had protected him from disappointment and loss. But then he looked at his son's face, hopeful, open, unconsciously modeling the vulnerability that had allowed him to accept Maria's gifts and begin healing in ways his father had been too frightened to attempt. "Yes," Elijah said, stepping into the kitchen's warm light. "I'd like to learn too." And as Maria began teaching both of them the recipe for soup that had comforted her own children through difficult times, Elijah realized that the question wasn't whether he could trust Maria with his son's heart, but whether he was brave enough to risk opening his own heart to the possibility that love could be shared rather than hoarded, that healing could be communal rather than solitary, and that the best way to honor Sarah's memory might be to allow their son to be raised by a community of people who had loved deeply enough to understand both loss and hope. The brass key felt heavier in Elijah's hand than its size should have warranted, as if 2 years of avoiding what it unlocked had somehow transferred weight to the metal itself. He stood outside the music room door at 7 in the morning, coffee cooling in his other hand, listening to the muffled sounds of Maria and Caleb beginning their daily routine upstairs. The decision to open this room hadn't been conscious exactly, more like the result of 3 weeks of watching his son blossom under Maria's patient teaching. 3 weeks of remembering what it felt like to want to participate in his child's joy rather than simply monitor it from a safe distance. The key turned smoothly, as if the lock had been waiting for this moment as long as he had been avoiding it. The door opened on a space that had been frozen in time, like a museum exhibit of his former happiness. Sarah's sheet music still arranged on the piano's music stand, her reading glasses folded beside a half-completed composition, her favorite coffee mug bearing the faint ghost of lipstick that had somehow survived 2 years of careful preservation. But it was the baby grand piano itself that stopped Elijah's breath in his throat. Sarah had chosen it during her 7th month of pregnancy, insisting that their child should grow up surrounded by music that had room to breathe, melodies that could fill space rather than being confined to the electronic constraints of keyboards and speakers. She'd spent hours at this bench during Caleb's first months, playing soft classical pieces while he napped in his portable crib beside her, singing the lullabies that had become the soundtrack of their son's earliest memories. Now dust particles danced in the morning light streaming through windows that had been sealed for too long, and the piano's ebony surface reflected his image back at him like a question he'd been avoiding. What kind of man locks away the things his wife loved most? "Dad?" Caleb's voice came from behind him, accompanied by the soft tap of his orientation cane against the doorframe. "Maria said you were down here. Is this Mama's piano room?" Elijah turned to find his son standing in the doorway, with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to read the emotional climate of spaces through subtle cues. The quality of silence, the way air moved differently in rooms that had been closed to life. Maria stood behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, her face carefully neutral, in the way of someone who understood she was witnessing a private family moment. "Yes," Elijah said, his voice hoarse with disuse of certain emotional registers. "This is where your mother played music." Caleb stepped into the room with the reverent caution of someone entering a cathedral, his cane sweeping carefully across the hardwood floors until it encountered the piano bench. His fingers traced its leather surface with the delicate exploration of someone trying to understand through touch what others experienced through sight. "It's beautiful," he said simply, and something in his tone suggested he was responding not just to the instrument's physical presence, but to something less tangible, the residual energy of love that had been made audible in this space, the accumulated emotional resonance of thousands of hours spent creating beauty. "Your mother played every day," Elijah found himself saying, words emerging from some part of his memory that had been carefully sealed away. "Even when she was tired, even when you were fussy as a baby, even when work was overwhelming. She said music was how she talked to God, how she made sense of feelings that were too big for regular words." Maria moved quietly to open the room's windows, letting fresh air chase away the staleness of prolonged grief. As she adjusted the curtains to let in more light, she spoke with the careful gentleness of someone who understood that healing sometimes required external permission to feel joy. "In my family, we believed that pianos hold the memory of every song played on them," she said. "My grandmother used to say that if you sat quietly enough, you could hear the echoes of all the love that had been expressed through the keys." Caleb had made his way to the piano bench and was sitting with perfect posture, his hands resting on his knees as if he was waiting for permission or inspiration to bridge the gap between himself and his mother's instrument. "Dad, would you play something Mama used to play?" The request hit Elijah like a physical blow. He hadn't touched a piano in over 2 years, hadn't even hummed a melody since the funeral, when Sarah's favorite hymn had reduced him to tears he'd spent months trying to forget. But looking at his son, hopeful, patient, unconsciously modeling the vulnerability that healing required, he found himself moving toward the bench, as if pulled by forces stronger than his fear. "I'm not very good," he warned, settling beside Caleb on the bench that had been sized for Sarah's smaller frame. "Your mother was the musician in our family, but you know her songs," Caleb said, with the logical confidence of a child who believed love automatically transmitted knowledge. "You heard them every day." Elijah placed his hands on the keys, muscle memory guiding his fingers to positions he hadn't consciously remembered learning. The piano was slightly out of tune, giving the first tentative notes a poignant quality that seemed appropriate for this reunion between father, son, and the instrument that had been witness to their family's happiest moments. The melody that emerged was halting, imperfect, but unmistakably the lullaby that had become central to their recent evening routines, the song Maria had taught Caleb, that Lucia had taught Sarah, that grandmothers had passed down through generations of women who understood that love required its own language. "That's it," Caleb whispered, his face bright with recognition and something deeper, the joy of connection, of understanding that the music he'd been learning existed as part of a larger story that included his mother, his father, and the mysterious network of love that had brought Maria into their lives. As Elijah played, his technique gradually steadying as forgotten skills returned to his fingers, he became aware that he was crying, not the devastating sobs that had characterized his grief for 2 years, but the quieter tears of someone who was finally allowing himself to remember joy alongside loss, to honor Sarah's memory by participating in, rather than avoiding, the beauty she had tried to build into their family's daily life. "Dad," Caleb said softly when the lullaby ended, "you do know Mama's songs. Maybe you could learn to play them better, and then we could play together." The suggestion carried such simple wisdom that Elijah felt something fundamental shift in his chest, not healing exactly, but the beginning of a willingness to be healed, to stop treating his grief as a monument to Sarah's love and start treating it as compost for whatever new forms love might take in their changed family. "Maria," he said, turning to include the woman who had somehow become their guide back toward connection, "would you be willing to teach us both? Not just Caleb, but both of us?" Maria's smile was radiant with the particular joy of someone who'd been waiting patiently for permission to offer gifts she'd been eager to share. "Mr. Moore, I think your wife would be very happy to know that her piano was being filled with music again. And I think she would be proud of how brave you're both being." As the three of them sat together on the bench that had been built for one, planning their first formal music lesson, Elijah realized that the room he'd kept locked for 2 years hadn't been preserving Sarah's memory. It had been imprisoning it. Now, with morning light streaming through open windows and the piano's voice restored to the daily soundtrack of their lives, he could feel something that had been frozen beginning to thaw. The healing wouldn't be quick or simple, he understood that. There would be days when the music would make him too sad to continue, moments when Caleb's growing skill would remind him painfully of all the things Sarah would miss watching their son accomplish. But there would also be discoveries, connections, the deep satisfaction of watching love find new expressions even in the aftermath of devastating loss. And maybe, with Maria's patient guidance and Caleb's unconscious wisdom showing him the way, he might learn to be the kind of father who could offer his son not just security and professional care, but the riskier gifts of presence, vulnerability, and the willingness to let their shared love for Sarah become a foundation for new love, rather than a barrier against it. The sealed letter arrived on a Saturday morning, delivered not by courier, but by Father Miguel himself, who had driven from Phoenix after what he described as a crisis of conscience that had kept me awake for 3 weeks. The elderly priest sat in Elijah's living room with the careful dignity of someone who understood he was about to disrupt a family's carefully constructed understanding of their own story. "Maria doesn't know I've come," he began, his accent lending gravity to words that already felt heavy with significance. "She would be furious if she knew I was here. But I cannot continue to carry this burden alone. Not when I see how much peace she's found in your home, how much healing she's helped create for your family." Father Miguel withdrew a manila envelope from his briefcase, its edges worn as if it had been handled many times over the past 2 years. "This was given to me by your wife, Mr. Moore, 6 months before she died. She made me promise to deliver it to Maria only if certain circumstances occurred. Specifically, if Maria ever took employment caring for a motherless child." Elijah stared at the envelope as if it might explode. Sarah's handwriting was clearly visible on the front. "For Maria Elena Gonzalez, when she is ready to heal another family, the way she helped heal my heart." "That's impossible," Elijah said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Sarah never mentioned anyone named Maria. She died in a car accident, sudden, unexpected. She couldn't have planned anything." Father Miguel's expression carried the particular sadness of someone who had spent decades helping families navigate the gap between what they believed about their loved ones and what those loved ones had actually experienced. "Mr. Moore, your wife came to see me 4 times during her final months. She had been diagnosed with a heart condition, genetic, progressive, likely to prove fatal within 2 to 5 years. She chose not to tell you because she didn't want to alter the time you had left together, didn't want her illness to define your son's earliest memories of his mother." The words hit Elijah like physical blows, each revelation recontextualizing months of memories he thought he understood. Sarah's increased fatigue during her final year, her sudden interest in organizing family documents, the way she'd begun taking more photographs than usual, her insistence on recording herself reading bedtime stories for when Caleb is older and wants to remember Mama's voice. The car accident, Father Miguel continued gently, occurred because she had a heart episode while driving. The investigating officers assumed it was sudden, but Sarah knew it was coming. She had been preparing for her death since the diagnosis, making arrangements you weren't aware of, because she wanted to protect you from having to live with countdown timer on your marriage. Elijah's hands shook as he reached for the envelope, Sarah's final secret burning through the paper like radioactive material. Inside was a letter written in her familiar script, dated 3 weeks before the accident that had ended her life and begun their family's long exile from Joy. "My dearest Maria," the letter began, and Elijah's voice caught as he read aloud words his wife had written for another woman while facing her own mortality. "I know this letter will find you only if the worst has happened, only if I have left Caleb and Elijah alone in ways they are not prepared to handle. I also know that receiving this letter means you have lost Lucia and that your own heart is broken in ways that make helping another broken family seem impossible. But I believe God sometimes calls us to heal through service, and that maybe helping my son learn to live with loss might help you learn to live with yours." The letter continued for 3 pages, revealing a side of Sarah that Elijah had never fully understood, the strategic mind that had helped build their business, now focused entirely on ensuring her family's emotional survival after her death. She had researched Maria's background through hospital records, had learned about her musical training, her experience with special needs children, her own devastating loss. She had even included specific instructions about where to find the keyboard, when Caleb might be ready for formal music lessons, and how to approach a grieving husband who would resist help even when he desperately needed it. She knew about Maria's daughter. Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Father Miguel nodded. "Sarah attended Lucia's funeral. She traveled to Phoenix on what you thought was a business trip, but she came to pay respects to the girl who had taught her the lullaby that became so important to your family." She and Maria spoke for hours that day about loss, about music, about the responsibility parents feel to prepare their children for a world that can be both beautiful and devastating. As Elijah continued reading, Sarah's voice emerged from the page with startling clarity. Not the Sarah he'd known as his wife and business partner, but Sarah the strategist, the woman who had faced her own death with the same methodical precision she'd brought to product launches and market analysis. "I have arranged for a substantial sum to be held in trust," the letter continued, "accessible to Maria only if she accepts employment in our household, and only after she has been there for at least 6 months. This is not payment for services. It is recognition that helping a family heal from devastating loss requires someone who has done their own deep work around grief. The money should be enough for Maria to pursue whatever dreams she deferred while raising her own children, enough to honor Lucia's memory in whatever way feels most meaningful." But it was the letter's final paragraphs that completely altered Elijah's understanding of everything that had happened since Maria's arrival in their lives. "Elijah will resist healing," Sarah had written with devastating accuracy. "He will treat grief as a memorial to our love, rather than as compost for new love. He will try to protect Caleb from additional loss by preventing additional connection. He will make music and joy seem like betrayals of my memory, instead of celebrations of the beauty we tried to build together. Maria, I am counting on you to be patient with his fear, to help him understand that the best way to honor what we had is to allow our son to experience love that is abundant rather than scarce, expansive rather than protective. Caleb will be ready for music earlier than Elijah expects. The keyboard is in the storage room, along with recordings I made of traditional lullabies and some original compositions I wrote for him. Help him discover that his blindness is not a limitation of his musical ability, but possibly an enhancement of it. Help him understand that he carries both his father's analytical mind and his mother's intuitive heart, and that both are gifts that can serve him and the world. The letter concluded with specific practical instructions: Dr. Martinez's contact information, the location of important family documents, even suggestions for how to gradually reintroduce music to a household that had rejected it as too painful to bear. But the final line was addressed not to Maria, but to Elijah himself. My beloved, if you are reading this, it means Maria has been brave enough to help our family, and you have been brave enough to let her. I hope you can forgive me for planning without your knowledge, but I needed to know that Caleb would have someone who understood that love doesn't end when life does. It just finds new expressions. Trust Maria, trust yourself. Trust that our love was strong enough to survive even death, and that the best way to honor it is to keep choosing love, even when choosing love means risking loss again. Elijah set the letter down with hands that had gone completely numb, his mind reeling with the implications of Sarah's elaborate planning, her profound understanding of how her death would affect both him and Caleb, and her faith that love could be strategic without being manipulative, protective without being constraining. She orchestrated all of this, he said, the words emerging as statement rather than question. Father Miguel's expression was gentle, but not apologetic. She prepared for it. There's a difference. Sarah understood that healing rarely happens accidentally, that broken families usually need guidance to find their way back to wholeness. She also understood that Maria would need purpose as much as your family would need help, that sometimes healing others is how we heal ourselves. As the full magnitude of Sarah's final gift settled around him like a benediction, Elijah realized that everything he'd interpreted as coincidence, Maria's arrival, her instinctive understanding of Caleb's needs, her mysterious knowledge of family songs, had actually been love in action. Love that had continued working even after the person who embodied it was no longer physically present to direct its effects. His wife hadn't just died and left them alone. She had died and arranged for them to be found by someone who could help them remember how to live again. She had transformed her own death from an ending into a bridge, ensuring that her family's capacity for joy would be restored by someone who understood both the depth of their loss and the possibility of their healing. The revelation was overwhelming, humbling, and ultimately liberating, because it meant that everything good that had happened in their household over the past few months wasn't accidental or temporary, but part of a larger plan that honored Sarah's love by expanding rather than constraining it. And somewhere in the kitchen, Maria was teaching Caleb to make pancakes while humming lullabies that connected him to both his mother's voice and a wider community of love that had been working to heal their family long before they'd understood. They were being healed. The confrontation came at dawn on Sunday morning, when Elijah found Maria in the kitchen preparing her usual quiet breakfast routine. She looked up from the coffee she was brewing with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting this conversation, had perhaps been waiting for it with the patient resignation of someone who understood that secrets, however well-intentioned, eventually demanded acknowledgement. You knew, Elijah said without preamble. Sarah's letter still clutched in his hand, like evidence of betrayal or benediction. He couldn't decide which. About the letter, about her planning, about all of it, Maria's hands stilled on the coffee carafe, and for a moment the only sound was the morning rain against the kitchen windows, gentle percussion that seemed to underscore the gravity of what they were about to discuss. Yes, she said simply, her voice carrying the dignity of someone who had always intended to tell the truth, but had been waiting for the right moment. I knew when I answered your employment advertisement. I knew when I accepted the position. I knew every day that I've been caring for Caleb. The admission hung in the kitchen's warm air, like a bridge that might support reconciliation or collapse under the weight of accumulated deception. Elijah studied Maria's face, searching for signs of manipulation or calculation. but found only the steady resolve of someone who had made difficult choices for reasons she believed were justified. "Why didn't you tell me?" Maria poured 2 cups of coffee with the automatic precision of someone buying time to choose her words carefully. "Because your wife specifically asked me not to. Because she understood that you needed to discover your capacity for healing gradually at your own pace. Because she knew that if you learned about her planning too early, you might reject help out of pride or anger rather than accepting it out of love." She handed him a cup, and he noticed that her hands were steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "Mr. Moore, I have been caring for children for 30 years. I have seen what happens to families when they close themselves off from healing because accepting help feels like admitting failure. Your wife didn't want that for you or Caleb." Elijah sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the letter spread before him like a map to territory he'd never imagined Sarah had explored. "She died knowing you would come here." "She died believing you would help us in ways I couldn't help myself. She died hoping," Maria corrected gently. "Hoping that I would be brave enough to honor her trust, hoping that you would be brave enough to let me help, hoping that Caleb would be open to connection even after experiencing devastating loss. None of it was guaranteed, Mr. Moore. It was all an act of faith. The distinction mattered," Elijah realized. Sarah hadn't manipulated their healing. She had created conditions that made healing possible, then trusted that love would do the rest of the work. The difference between control and provision, between manipulation and preparation. "There's something else," Maria continued, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone approaching the most sensitive part of a difficult conversation. "The trust fund she mentioned in the letter, I haven't touched it. I won't touch it unless you and Caleb explicitly agree that my presence here has been beneficial to your family. The money isn't why I came, and it's not why I've stayed." "Then why?" Elijah's question carried the bewilderment of someone trying to understand motivations that seemed too generous to be credible. "Why accept employment from strangers? Why take on the emotional complexity of helping a family heal from the same kind of loss that devastated your own life?" Maria sat across from him at the table where she'd taught Caleb to measure spices, where they'd shared countless quiet conversations about music and memory, and the ways love persisted even in the absence of the people who had embodied it. "Because your wife understood something about grief that I was still learning," she said. "She understood that pain can become either poison or compost, that loss can either destroy us or transform us into people capable of deeper love than we ever imagined possible. Lucia's death nearly destroyed me, Mr. Moore. I spent 18 months after her funeral believing that my capacity for joy had died with her, that the world had taken more from me than I could possibly give back." She paused to sip her coffee, and Elijah saw in her momentary silence the weight of remembered devastation, the long nights of believing that survival was the best she could hope for rather than any return to meaningful life. "But Sarah's letter offered me something. I didn't even know I needed. The possibility that my experience with loss might become a gift I could offer to another family struggling with the same darkness. She helped me understand that helping you and Caleb heal wasn't charity or obligation, but mutual healing. Every day that I've watched Caleb discover his musical abilities, every moment that I've seen you remember how to smile at your son's joy, I've also been remembering that love doesn't have to end when life does." The explanation struck Elijah as so completely reasonable, so aligned with everything he'd observed about Maria's patient competence and genuine affection for Caleb, that his anger began to transform into something more complex, gratitude mixed with grief, appreciation shadowed by the overwhelming realization of how much strategic love Sarah had invested in their future well-being. "She thought of everything," he said, the words carrying wonder rather than resentment. "She thought of the important things," Maria replied. "But Mr. Moore, the specific ways healing has happened in your family, those weren't in her letter. Those came from you and Caleb being brave enough to risk connection. being willing to let music back into your lives even when it was painful, being open to the possibility that joy and grief could coexist rather than compete. As if summoned by their conversation, Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sound of adult voices and the particular quality of attention that suggested important things were being discussed. He moved with the confident navigation of someone completely at home in this space, someone who had learned to read the emotional climate through subtle cues that went beyond what sighted people typically noticed. "Are you talking about Mama?" he asked with the directness of a child who had grown comfortable discussing complex emotions. "I had a dream about her last night. She was listening to me play piano and she looked happy." Elijah looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the damaged child he'd been trying to protect for 2 years, but a boy who had somehow learned to integrate loss into a worldview that still included the possibility of happiness. Caleb's face carried the particular serenity of someone who had processed grief with help, rather than in isolation, who had learned to see his mother's absence as ongoing presence, rather than simple void. "Yes, we were talking about Mama," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the emotional complexity of the moment. "And about how much she loved you, how much she wanted to make sure you would always have people who could help you remember that love. Like Maria," Caleb said matter-of-factly, moving to wrap his arms around Maria's shoulders in the unconscious physical affection of someone who had never doubted her belonging in their family. "Yes, like Maria." For the next hour, as morning light gradually filled the kitchen and transformed it from a space of confession into a space of planning, the three of them discussed the letter's contents with the careful attention of people working together to understand how the past had shaped their present and how their present might shape their future. Maria shared details about her correspondence with Sarah, the months of preparation that had preceded her arrival in their household, the specific observations Sarah had made about Caleb's likely needs and Elijah's probable resistance patterns. But she also talked about the things Sarah couldn't have planned, the daily discoveries of Caleb's musical intuition, the gradual thawing of Elijah's emotional armor, the way their household had slowly transformed from a place of careful silence into a place where laughter and music coexisted with memory and loss. "There's going to be a recital," Caleb announced during a pause in their conversation, his voice bright with the excitement of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to share important news. "Maria says I'm ready to play for other people, not just for us. She says maybe some of her friends from church would like to hear the songs I've learned." Elijah felt a familiar flutter of protective anxiety, the old impulse to shield Caleb from any situation that might result in disappointment or judgment. But looking at his son's face, radiant with anticipation and confidence, he realized that the greater risk might be protecting Caleb from opportunities to share his gifts with the world. "When?" he asked. "Next Saturday evening. Just a small gathering, maybe 8 or 10 people who understand that music is about sharing love rather than proving perfection." Maria's explanation carried the careful reassurance of someone who had planned this moment with the same attention to emotional safety that had characterized all her interactions with their family. "And you want to do this, Caleb? You feel ready?" "I want to play Mama's lullaby for people who might need to hear it," Caleb said, with the simple wisdom of someone who had learned that art was most meaningful when it was shared. "Maria says music is how we help other people remember they're not alone with their feelings." As Elijah agreed to the recital, as he watched Maria and Caleb begin planning the details with the excited collaboration of people embarking on a meaningful adventure, he realized that this moment represented more than just musical performance. It represented the completion of Sarah's vision, not just healing for their family, but their family's healing becoming a gift they could offer to others who might be struggling with their own losses and limitations. The scared, isolated man who had hired Maria 6 months ago would never have allowed his blind son to perform for strangers. but the man he was becoming, the father Sarah had somehow known he could become, understood that sharing their story of healing might be exactly what some other broken family needed to hear. And maybe, in the act of witnessing Caleb's courage and Maria's patient love, he would finally understand that Sarah's greatest gift hadn't been her planning or her strategic provision for their future, but her faith that love could multiply rather than diminish when it was shared, openly and generously with the world. Saturday evening arrived with the particular quality of light that made ordinary moments feel touched by significance, golden hour sunshine streaming through the music room's tall windows, casting everything in the warm glow that photographers chase and families remember years later as the background to their most treasured memories. Elijah stood in the hallway outside the music room, straightening his tie for the third time in as many minutes, listening to the gentle murmur of voices as Maria's friends from St. Augustine's Catholic Church settled into the folding chairs they'd arranged in a semicircle around Sarah's baby grand piano. The guest list was small but carefully chosen, people who had experienced their own losses, who understood that music could be both celebration and memorial, who would receive Caleb's performance as gift rather than evaluate it as entertainment. Through the partially open door, he could see Caleb sitting at the piano bench with the composed dignity of someone who had discovered something important about himself and was eager to share it with the world. His small hands rested quietly on the keys, not playing yet, but simply making contact with the instrument that had become his primary means of connecting with his mother's memory and his own, emerging identity as someone whose blindness enhanced rather than limited his musical perception. Maria moved through the room, with the quiet efficiency of someone ensuring that every detail supported the emotional significance of what was about to happen. She adjusted the height of Caleb's bench, positioned a small lamp to cast warm light across the piano keys, and spoke briefly with each guest, not about Caleb's limitations or the tragedy that had shaped his young life, but about the extraordinary musical intuition they were about to witness, and the courage he'd shown in choosing to share his gifts despite having every reason to remain hidden behind protective walls. "Dad, are you coming in?" Caleb's voice carried across the room with the particular clarity that had become characteristic of his speech since beginning his musical studies. More confident, more precise, as if discovering his abilities had given him permission to inhabit space more fully. Elijah entered the room that had been sealed for 2 years and was now filled with gentle anticipation, taking his seat in the front row beside Dr. Martinez, who had arrived early with flowers and the warm smile of someone who had watched this family's gradual healing with professional satisfaction and personal joy. "He's ready," she murmured as Elijah settled beside her. "More ready than you are, I suspect." She was right, Elijah realized. While Caleb radiated the calm confidence of someone who had found his element, Elijah felt the familiar flutter of protective anxiety that had characterized his parenting since Sarah's death, the constant fear that allowing his son to be vulnerable in public might result in disappointment or judgment that would undo months of careful progress. But looking around the room at Maria's carefully selected audience, Mrs. Chen, whose husband had died the previous year, Father Miguel, who had driven from Phoenix specifically for this evening, James, who sat with his wife and teenage daughter, all of them wearing expressions of gentle expectation rather than critical assessment, Elijah began to understand that this gathering represented community rather than performance, witness rather than judgment. "Before Caleb plays," Maria said, addressing the small group with the natural authority of someone who understood that important moments required context, "I want to share something about why this evening matters so much to our family. 6 months ago, this piano was silent, this room was locked, and this beautiful boy was learning to navigate the world without one of the most important tools for understanding himself and connecting with others." She moved to stand beside Caleb, her hand resting gently on his shoulder in a gesture that conveyed both support and pride. Music found its way back into this house, the same way healing often happens, gradually, through patience, through the willingness of people to risk connection, even when connection might lead to loss. What you're going to hear tonight isn't just beautiful music, though it certainly is that. You're going to hear the sound of a family learning to choose love over fear, community over isolation, hope over despair. Caleb smiled at Maria's words, then turned toward the piano with the focused attention of someone preparing to offer his most precious gifts to people who had gathered specifically to receive them. His hands found their starting position on the keys with the muscle memory of someone who had practiced not just techniques, but emotional expression, someone who had learned to channel feeling through fingertips in ways that transcended the mechanical aspects of musical performance. "This first song," Caleb said, his voice carrying the particular gravity that children possess when they understand they are about to share something important, "was my mama's favorite lullaby. She learned it from a friend who taught her that love doesn't need words, just melody. Maria helped me understand that when I play it, I'm not just remembering Mama, I'm helping other people remember that love doesn't end when people go away." The room settled into the expectant silence that precedes meaningful performance, and Elijah felt his breath catch as Caleb's fingers touched the keys with the delicate precision of someone who had learned to make music not despite his blindness, but because of the particular way his disability had sharpened his other senses. The first notes of Sarah's lullaby filled the room like a prayer made audible, and Elijah realized that he was about to witness not just his son's musical debut, but the culmination of Sarah's elaborate gift to their family, the moment when private healing became public testimony to the possibility that broken hearts could learn to sing. Again, the lullaby emerged from the piano with a tenderness that seemed to transform the evening air itself, each note carrying the weight of love that had traveled across generations, across languages, across the seemingly unbridgeable gap between life and death. Caleb played with the unconscious grace of someone who had finally found the language his soul had been searching for, his small fingers moving across the keys with a confidence that transcended technical proficiency and entered the realm of pure expression. Elijah watched his son's face as the familiar melody filled the room, and saw there something he'd been too frightened to hope for, joy that existed independently of tragedy, connection that wasn't diminished by loss, a wholeness that incorporated blindness and grief without being defined by them. This was the child Sarah had envisioned when she'd planned her elaborate gift, the boy who could carry her love forward not as burden, but as blessing. The melody reached its gentle crescendo, and Caleb's playing took on a complexity that surprised even Elijah, who had been listening to his son's daily practice sessions. The simple lullaby began to incorporate variations, subtle harmonies that suggested hours of experimentation, emotional shadings that spoke to an intuitive understanding of how music could hold multiple feelings simultaneously. This wasn't just performance. It was interpretation, creation, the transformation of inherited love into something uniquely his own. In the small audience, Elijah could see faces reflecting the same recognition he was, experiencing the understanding that they were witnessing something that transcended entertainment and approached the sacred. Mrs. Chen had tears streaming down her cheeks, her expression one of someone hearing their own grief transformed into something bearable through melody. Father Miguel sat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes closed, as if receiving communion through sound rather than sacrament. When the lullaby concluded, the silence that followed felt full rather than empty, the kind of quiet that occurs when people need time to absorb what they've just experienced. Then Caleb turned toward his small audience, with the pleased expression of someone who had successfully shared something precious and seen it received with appreciation. "That song connects me to my mama," he said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that had become characteristic of his speech, but it also connects me to Maria's daughter Lucia, and to all the grandmothers who sang it before any of us were born. Maria taught me that music is how love travels between people, even when those people live in different times or different places. Without pause, he turned back to the piano and began a second piece, this one more complex, more clearly his own creation, despite being built on the familiar foundation of the lullaby's harmonic structure. His playing had gained confidence from the audience's receptive attention, and now he was demonstrating not just his technical skill, but his emerging voice as someone who could create beauty rather than simply reproduce it. As the second melody unfolded, Elijah found himself remembering fragments of conversation from recent weeks. Caleb explaining that he could hear colors in different musical keys. Maria describing how traditional lullabies from Guatemala incorporated the sounds of rain and wind and birds. Dr. Martinez noting that Caleb's emotional vocabulary had expanded dramatically since beginning his musical studies. All of these observations coalesced into understanding as he watched his son create music that was simultaneously ancient and completely new, rooted in tradition yet utterly personal. The performance continued for 20 minutes, each piece building on the last, demonstrating not just Caleb's technical progress, but his growing understanding of music as emotional language. He played variations on traditional folk songs that Maria had taught him, original compositions that incorporated the sound patterns he associated with different memories, and finally a piece he introduced as a song for people who are learning to be happy again after being very sad. When the final notes faded into the evening air, the applause that followed was gentle rather than enthusiastic, the kind of appreciation that recognizes the sacred rather than the spectacular. Several people wiped tears from their eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that they had witnessed healing made audible. Hope transformed into melody. Caleb, James said as people began to move around the room, offering congratulations and sharing their own stories of how music had helped them through difficult times. That was extraordinary. Where did you learn to play like that? Caleb's answer was typically direct and profound. Maria taught me the songs, but Mama taught me how to feel them. And Dad taught me that it's okay to share feelings with other people, even when those feelings are complicated. The last part of his statement caused Elijah to catch his breath. When had he taught Caleb that? When had his own gradual healing become visible enough for his son to recognize and learn from? Looking back over the past few months, he realized that his willingness to sit with Caleb during practice sessions, his decision to unlock the music room, his growing comfort with conversations about Sarah, all of these choices had been teaching Caleb that emotions could be shared rather than hidden, that vulnerability could be strength rather than weakness. As the evening concluded and guests began to leave, each one stopping to thank Caleb for his gift and to offer encouragement for his continued musical development, Elijah found himself standing beside Maria in the doorway, watching their son accept praise with the gracious dignity of someone who understood that his gifts were meant to be shared. Sarah would be so proud, Maria said quietly, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had completed an important mission while discovering her own renewal in the process. She is proud, Elijah replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. And she's here in every note he played, in every person who was touched by his music, in the community that gathered to witness his courage. As the last guest departed and the three of them began quietly restoring the music room to its normal configuration, Elijah realized that the evening had marked more than just Caleb's musical debut. It had been the completion of Sarah's vision, the transformation of their family's private healing into public testimony to the possibility that love could survive any loss, that broken hearts could learn to sing again, and that the best way to honor what had been lost was to remain open to what might be found. 6 months after the recital, Elijah arrived home from work to find music floating through the house again, not the tentative, halting melodies of early learning, but the confident harmonies of a family that had rediscovered its voice. The sound drew him up the stairs to the music room, where he paused in the doorway to witness a scene that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. Caleb sat at the baby grand piano, his posture relaxed and confident, playing a complex arrangement that wove together the familiar lullaby with variations of his own creation. But he wasn't playing alone. Maria sat beside him on the bench, adding a gentle bass line that provided harmonic foundation for his melodic explorations. And in the chair that Sarah had always favored during her practice sessions, James's teenage daughter Emma was learning to play a simple wooden flute that she held with the careful attention of someone discovering that she, too, might have musical gifts worth developing. "Dad!" Caleb's greeting was bright with the particular joy of someone eager to share a new discovery. "Listen to what we learned today." Emma's flute makes the lullaby sound like it's being played by wind through trees, and Maria showed me how to make the piano sound like water running over stones. As they resumed playing, their three instruments creating a gentle symphony that filled the room with layers of complementary sound. Elijah noticed the framed photograph that now sat atop the piano, a picture from the recital showing Caleb at the keys, surrounded by the small audience whose faces reflected the wonder and healing they'd experienced through his music. It had become the first new photograph displayed in their home since Sarah's death, the beginning of a visual record of their life after loss. The room itself had been transformed over the months since that first evening when Maria had unlocked its doors. Sarah's sheet music still occupied places of honor, but it was now accompanied by new compositions, pieces that Caleb had written, traditional songs that Maria had taught them, even a few simple melodies that Elijah had attempted during his own tentative return to musical expression. The space had become a living memorial rather than a preserved shrine, a place where Sarah's love continued to generate new beauty rather than simply protecting old memories. "How was your day?" Maria asked as the music concluded, her question carrying the comfortable intimacy of someone who had become family rather than employee. A transition that had been formalized 3 months earlier when Elijah had asked her to consider staying permanently, not as hired help, but as the grandmother Caleb had never had, the wise woman their household had needed to remember how to be whole. "Productive," Elijah replied, settling into the chair he'd claimed during these evening music sessions. "The Jakarta expansion is ahead of schedule, and James thinks we'll be ready to announce the new community outreach program next month." The community program had been Caleb's idea, inspired by his recital experience and his growing understanding that his musical gifts could serve purposes beyond personal healing. Working with Dr. Martinez and several local organizations, they were developing music therapy sessions for other families dealing with loss, disability, or trauma, a way of sharing what they'd learned about the healing power of creative expression and community support. "Mrs. Patterson says Emma's flute teacher thinks she has real talent," Maria added, smiling at the girl who had become a regular fixture in their musical household. "She wants to audition for the youth orchestra next fall." Emma blushed with the pleased embarrassment of someone whose gifts were being recognized by adults she respected. Her presence in their home had become another unexpected blessing, a reminder that healing families naturally attracted other people who needed connection, that their house was becoming a place where music created community rather than simply preserving memory. As they talked about the day's events, Caleb's progress with a new composition he was writing for Children's Hospital, Maria's plans for expanding their informal music group to include other children from St. Augustine's, Emma's excitement about possibly performing with Caleb at the community center's spring concert, Elijah marveled at how naturally conversation flowed when it wasn't constrained by grief or fear of triggering painful memories. "There's something I want to show you," Caleb said during a pause in their discussion, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to reveal something special. He moved to the piano bench and opened the small wooden box where he kept his most treasured possessions, the original keyboard Maria had found, a recording of Sarah singing lullabies, and now something new. "I wrote this for Mama," he said, withdrawing a handwritten piece of sheet music covered in Braille notation that Maria had helped him learn to use. "It's called Love That Travels, and it's about how the people we love don't really go away. They just find new ways to help us remember what love feels like." As Caleb played his original composition, a piece that incorporated elements of Sarah's lullaby but transformed them into something entirely new, something that spoke to continuity rather than ending, Elijah felt the final pieces of his long healing click into place. This wasn't music that mourned Sarah's absence. It was music that celebrated her continuing presence in their daily lives, in Caleb's gifts, in the family they had rebuilt with Maria's patient guidance. When the piece concluded, the room was filled with the kind of silence that follows profound beauty, not empty quiet, but the full pause of people absorbing something that has touched them deeply. "She can hear it," Caleb said with the matter-of-fact certainty that had become characteristic of his relationship with his mother's memory. "Not just because I'm playing it, but because it's helping other people remember that love doesn't stop just because people aren't here anymore." As evening settled over their house, a house that had learned to hold both memory and hope, both loss and new love, Elijah realized that Sarah's greatest gift hadn't been her strategic planning for their future, though that had been remarkable. Her greatest gift had been her faith that love could expand rather than diminish when it was shared, that healing was possible even in the aftermath of devastating loss, and that families could learn to honor their past by remaining open to whatever forms of blessing the future might offer. The music room that had once been a tomb of preserved grief had become a laboratory of ongoing love, a space where 3 generations of people who had learned to choose connection over isolation gathered each evening to create something beautiful together. And in the harmony of their voices, in the blend of their different instruments, in the easy laughter that punctuated their practice sessions, Sarah's lullaby continued to work its gentle magic, not as ending, but as eternal beginning, not as memorial to what had been lost, but as celebration of what love could become when it was allowed to grow beyond the boundaries of any single life.